Hello guys and welcome back. So this is our final part of the course and we need to look at what happens in the 1970s. So at this point the USSR are led by Brezhnev, who's here, and the USA is led by Nixon. As we discussed before, these men were old warriors. They had been at the center of power for many years now, and by this point they were able to cooperate like never before. This period of time in the 1970s, at this point in the Cold War, is what we call détente. Now, détente is a French word used to describe the period at the end of the 1960s into the second half of the 1970s. The word means relaxation, and this period is characterized by improved relations and decreased tensions. By this time, there is much greater dialogue between the two countries, and the threat of war has been significantly reduced. Summits are regularly held between Brezhnev and Nixon, and for the first time, agreements were made to reduce the number of nuclear weapons that each country had. After 30 years, we finally see a desire to come together. So there are a couple of reasons why this happened. I'm going to go through them one by one. So reason number one is the Chinese-Soviet split. By the late 1960s, the relationship between the two most powerful communist states, the USSR and China, had significantly deteriorated and broken down, as we've previously talked about. Mao, the leader of China, did not share the views of Khrushchev or Brezhnev, and with Stalin's death, the relationship just starts to degrade and degrade more over time. This is a really good opportunity for America because communism is no longer one single united force. So America sees the opportunity to develop a better relationship with China. This all begins in 1971 when the US table tennis team traveled to China for a tournament. And this is hugely important for US-Chinese relations. It becomes known as ping pong diplomacy. Now, 1 year later in 1972, Nixon becomes the first US president ever to visit China, and he undertakes a 7-day visit to 3 cities. His arrival in Beijing ends 25 years of no communication or diplomatic ties between the two countries. Ever since the People's Republic of China was announced in 1949, the USA have not spoken to them or recognized them as the leader of the country. In 1979, the USA established full diplomatic relations with the People's Republic of China and completely repaired those tensions between the USA and China. Now, they use this as leverage with the USSR. Nixon calls this visit the week that changed the world, and instant consequences were a further wedge between the Soviet Union and China. And it also spawned China's opening up to the world and beginning of being able to gain economic parity, so to the same economic level with capitalist countries. Nixon also hoped that by engaging in this visit, he would slow down Chinese and USSR's provision of weapons to Hanoi and the Viet Cong in order to try to stop the Vietnam War. Okay, this brings us to reason number 2. Now, reason number two is the nuclear weapons and the nuclear arms race. So, nuclear arms race had reached its height in 1962 with the Cuban Missile Crisis. This had shown that in reality, neither side were willing to use nuclear weapons when it would risk ruining their own country and creating their own destruction. This therefore marks the beginning of improved relations. In 1963, Khrushchev and Kennedy had signed the Partial Test Ban Treaty and established a hotline between Moscow and Washington. Now, as we've looked at previously, other factors such as human rights abuses had now become equally as important. However, by the end of the 1960s, this was no longer the sole point of tension. In addition, other countries such as France and Britain had now developed nuclear weapons also. These countries were close allies of America, so to the USSR, if France had nuclear weapons, they were technically just an extension of America's nuclear weapons. So even though we had some discussions over weapons, there were still some issues. In 1964, China successfully tested a nuclear bomb and developed a hydrogen bomb by 1967. This was a concern to both sides. The fear that an unreliable government could develop nuclear weapons increased anxiety on both sides and encouraged cooperation to try to limit this new technology. Right, the next reason is number 3, and that is lessons of conflict. So, the war in Vietnam had shown that huge military power and possession of nuclear weapons did not guarantee success or victory. The Americans, for example, had far superior military spending, nuclear weapons, and yet they still had not been able to beat the Viet Cong in Vietnam. Increasingly, the USA and the USSR were able to defend their interests without direct involvement. In the conflict in the Middle East, the Arab-Israeli conflict, for example, the USA offered support to Israel while the USSR supported Syria and Egypt. Neither side wanted to directly engage in the war themselves. I'm going to explain one very small part of this in a bit more detail for a really good understanding for grade 7 to grade 9. However, the date of the war I'm going to talk about falls outside our official course dates by 1 year. So you don't need to write about it, and it's a very small piece of information, but something which, if you are going for grade 7 to grade 9, is interesting for you to understand, and you can mention as an example, but not as a main example. So the Arab-Israeli conflict is a huge topic in itself, and I'm only going to be talking about a very small part of it. Now, it's hugely controversial, highly politicized, and still a very, very important issue today. So I'm not going to be talking about, morally right or wrong or whose side I agree with. I don't want to go into that. I'm just concentrating on the impact it had on the Cold War. In October 1973, during the Jewish holy festival of Yom Kippur, Egypt and Syria launched a surprise attack on Israel. Their aim was to recover land taken by Israel during the 1967 Six-Day War. After Israel's recovery from this surprise attack, they started to push the Arab forces back. The USA provided weapons and funds to Israel, whereas Egypt and Syria were being funded by the USSR. On October the 9th, the Soviet Cultural Center in Damascus was damaged during an Israeli airstrike, and 2 days later, the Soviet merchant ship Ilya Menshnikov was sunk by the Israeli Navy during a battle off Syria. The Soviets sent 2 warships to the Syrian coast, and the ships exchanged fire with Israeli forces several times. Brezhnev told Nixon that he would send forces to support the Egyptian side unless he put pressure on the Israelis to agree to a ceasefire. The USA was closely aligned with Israel, so this had the danger of escalating to a large conflict between the superpowers. It could have been a second proxy war of the scale of Vietnam. Nixon, however, alleviated the problem by proposing a peacekeeping force of non-nuclear nations sent by the UN. Brezhnev agreed, and the war ended by the end of October. This shows how both sides had successfully avoided getting entangled into a proxy war. It exemplifies the progress that had been made since the beginning of the war in Vietnam. Okay, so the fourth and final reason why we have détente is to do with economics. Both countries have spent billions of dollars fighting the Cold War, and it's increasingly clear that no end was in sight. Continuing the arms and space race would have bankrupted the USSR within a few years, and neither country could go on spending this much on their defense. In 1969, West and East Germany agreed not to develop nuclear weapons. It recognized it was finally time to talk.